please welcome Lindsay Rapacchi to the stage.
Afternoon, everyone. So we're going to be talking about mental availability, and I want to begin with a very, very quick lesson in exactly what mental availability is. And for that, I've commandeered this gentleman's help. This is Ben, is that right?
Yeah.
Ben? Right, Ben is going to help us facilitate a quick game of Pictionary, which is going to tell us everything you need to know about mental availability. So Ben, the way this is going to work, I'm going to give you a cue, right? And when I give you this cue, you're going to try and draw as many brands as possible in sequence, okay? Now, unlike Pictionary, I'm going to allow you to use words, but you can't write the brand name. But if you want to write anything else, you can write anything other than the brand name, okay? Right, as Ben's doing that, you guys are going to hopefully guess the brands that Ben is trying to describe, okay? And we're going to start the timer as soon as I give Ben his cue. Now, I should point out that my fate rests in your hands and your hands. Now, if this is an absolute shit show, it's not my fault, it's you. So, if we can have the whiteboard on the screen, please. Perfect. Right, Ben, Sandra, if you could start 60 seconds for me when I give Ben his cue. And your cue is this, Ben. Savoury snacks to enjoy with the football. Savoury snacks to enjoy with the football. Go.
Pringles. Thank you. Walkers. Yes, thank you.
I see what you've done there.
Yes.
Nice. Too easy.
Hill hoops.
Very good.
Time's up.
Time's up. That's it, Ben. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben, take a seat. We have the PowerPoint now, please. So there, you've seen a perfect illustration of exactly what mental availability is, as defined by that wonderful Ironberg Bass Institute. We took a cue, we took a category entry point. These are the cues that category buyers use to access their memories when faced with a buying situation. And Ben expertly demonstrated the brands that he has mental availability for, the brands that he associates with that cue. Savoury snacks for the football. And he also gave us a wonderful illustration of distinctive brand assets as well. He showed us all the assets that he links these memories to, things like a Pringles pot and that distinctive Doritos product shape. And that is mental availability. It describes a brand's propensity to be thought of in a buying situation. And this stuff is absolute gold dust. I could have given you any number of different examples to show you the value of mental availability, but I've opted for this piece. It's a piece by the Australian Ad Council, Peter Field and Robert Britton. They took all of the studies in this data bank and they separated them into 3 groups, depending on the average shifts in mental availability from not very much to a significant amount. And then we look at each of those groups in terms of these key KPIs here, and we're going to look at the proportion of each of those groups that managed to shift these metrics by a significant amount. Our first group, not without success, but not exactly setting the world alight. Our next group, things begin to build. We see more and more effectiveness until suddenly those campaigns that are able to shift mental availability by a significant amount, 54% of those showing short-term sales response, 36% of them showing new customer acquisition, 37% showing brand profit growth. This stuff is absolute gold dust. And with that in mind, we wanted to explore a little bit more exactly what this mental availability is. Because when you have this discussion with people, it often comes across as this almost kind of ethereal magic concept, and it's not that at all. We looked at mental availability for 3 categories. We looked at high street fashion, soft drinks and streaming services. And I'm going to share with you some of our findings from the streaming services category. Now, the first thing on a journey through mental availability that you have to do is identify those category entry points. These are often described as the building blocks of mental availability. So we did a survey of 1,000 people and we asked what the Bass Institute called the W's. These are a series of questions, things like who, how, why, that allow you to unpick the motivations and behaviours that sit behind category entry. We did that for all these categories, and for streaming services we were able to piece this all together to identify 8 key entry points. Things like streaming to entertain the kids or something to relieve commuter boredom. And then what you're able to recognise is that different people will recognise different category entry points, and it's here that things get really, really interesting. What we were able to do in our second phase of research, you then take these category entry points and we asked 1,000 category buyers to tell us which entry points they recognise and crucially which brands they associate to each of these building blocks. And it's this stuff that is wonderful. It's this that you can measure and track, study and start to make really intuitive marketing decisions from. And I'm going to share with you some of the results now. So we looked at some of the Bass Institute's key metrics based on all of the data that we'd collected. And that means that we can look at things like network size, which asks the question, on average, how many category entry points do people associate with my brand? Over here, we've got some real heavyweights, the likes of Netflix and Prime Video with great big network sizes. For those people, it's about refreshing those links, maybe targeting key competitors who are getting a bit big for their boots. If you're over on this side, it's about building wider, fresher networks, maybe targeting specific CPs that you're not doing too well on, or perhaps looking at CPs that you've maybe not spoken about for a while and revisiting those. We can also look at mental penetration. This asks the question of all those category buyers, how many people have at least one reason to buy me? How many people associate my brand to at least one category entry point? Same heavyweights over here on the left. Refresh those links, target competitors, but also check in with sales penetration as well. If your mental penetration is a great deal higher than your sales penetration, then you might have an issue with convergence because people are thinking of your brand, but they're not actually buying it. Over here, you're going to need to increase your reach more category buyers, increase your penetration, maybe even start to adapt your offering so that you're more appropriate for more category entry points. We can also look at mental market share. This looks at all of the category entry points and asks the question of all the links that my brand has to all category entry points, what proportion of total links is that? Same heavyweights over here, refresh these, target competitors, cross-check in with market share this time to see if there's an issue with convergence. Over here, check that your messages are well branded. If you're spending an awful lot of money on media and people are not associating your brand with a category entry point, it might just be that you're not branding correctly. A message is wasted if it doesn't anchor back to brand. Similarly, you might want to review your ad choices. If you think you're doing all the right things, but you're not building mental market share, then it might be time to look at your media choices. Now, once you've done this brilliant analysis, once you start to embark on this journey, I think you end up here, okay? You end up in need of picking a fight. Because you're going to start to decide that you either need to increase your network size, your penetration, your mental market share, and you're going to say, well, okay, there's a particular brand that I want to have a pop at, and you're going to look at a couple of its category entry points and start to target those. Or it might be a broader challenge than that, and you're going to look at a broad category entry point and go after that entry point and all the brands that are associated with it. And when you look at media in this way, you can see these fights popping up all over the place. There's a few that I've particularly enjoyed of late. We've got 2 heavyweights slugging it out here. Category entry point, a biscuit to enjoy while taking a break. Twix, clearly fed up with Kit Kat's dominance of this, and they're starting to try and fight for that mental availability. Another example here, Guinness, one of the real giants of the sport, if you will. Traditionally a winter drink, now interested in attaching themselves to a new entry point, a refreshing pint on a hot day. It's going to be a difficult challenge up against some real tough competition with all those lagers and ciders, but arguably if anyone can do it, Guinness can. Now, once you're in this, you have to get into the fight for real. It's time to start fighting, and I like to think the fights look something like this. We're going to take an example of entertaining the kids as our CP. We're going to say that Prime Video, who've got 24% mental penetration for this, are going to fight everyone else in that category. And the thing you're going to do, you're going to throw your best right hook. You're going to deliver a message that says, please associate my brand with this category entry point. And then as Byron Sharp says, this is what's going to happen. A brand's advertising reinforces or builds the memory structures that make the brand more likely to come to mind in a buying situation. Then it will nudge their propensity to buy the brand. This is the sales effect. And that's what's going to happen, right? You're going to throw that best right hook, your mental availability is going to start to build, and these other guys are going to start to decay, and they're going to start to take a hit. But you can't run around punching people in the face and think you're going to get away with it. It doesn't work like that. These guys are going to be back up on their feet, and this is going to happen. Byron Sharp says most sales won't even show up because before the consumer even buys from the category, he or she will be hit with a competitor advertising message that nullifies the effect of the advertising. And that's what's going to happen. Those punches are going to come thick and fast from all of those other brands. They're going to start to build their mental availability, and you are going to get knocked on your arse, right? Now, when you look at fights in this way, it's interesting to think that you could ever even win these fights. The odds seem stacked against us. But that's what I love about media. That's what I love about media planning, is that this is not a fair fight. This is not Queensberry rules. This is bare knuckle, anything goes boxing. And there are certain tactics that you can employ to ensure that you end up victorious in these fights. And I want to finish on 3 knockout blows. The first knockout blow, you need to punch above your weight. And by punch above your weight, I refer to extra share of voice. This idea that you should, as a rule, take your market share and spend more than your market share as a percentage of total category ad spend. So if my market share is 20%, then I want to make sure that my percentage of category ad spend is greater than 20%. And that will get you gains in mental availability. Another example from the Australian Ad Council, 4 categories here, our case studies grouped into 4 lots depending on the average level of extra share of voice, from about -8 up to +7. You're going to look at each of those groups and see the percentage of studies in each group that reported significant shifts in mental availability. And they all line up beautifully. Perfect correlation. More extra share of voice, more mental availability. Round number 2, look for the weak spots. Now, when I talk about weak spots, I'm talking about targeting light category buyers. This is a buyer distribution curve for Walker's Crisp, but they look the same for pretty much any category vertical and any brand that you can think of. If you're a competitor to Walker's Crisp and you're trying to fight for mental availability, do not pick a fight with these people. One of the best ways to reinforce mental availability is through frequent purchase and product usage. And these guys are doing it all the time. They know how to take a punch. These guys have got weak chins, okay? They're not buying much, they're not reinforcing mental availability. Go after these and it's an easy fight. You must start to target the weak spots, target light category buyers. Final round, plant your feet. A decent punch starts by anchoring yourself to the canvas and you transfer that weight upwards, and that is absolutely true of advertising as well. As Jenny Romaniak from the Bass Institute says, if a communication piece has a well-branded message, it should increase the link between the brand and the attributes that represent that message. There is no point running around punching everybody if they don't know who is throwing that punch. Messages have to anchor back to brand so people know to associate that brand with that category entry point. And I often think, obviously I work within out of home, that if you're dealing with short attention times like in out of home, you should almost start to think about how you can use those wonderful distinctive brand assets that Ben demonstrated and start to design things where even if we take this brand away, we're in no doubt as to exactly who we should be anchoring back to brand. And we've got a brand new piece of work coming out in Q4 that talks about this, about how to use distinctive brand assets, and also, if you haven't got them, the best ways to go about building them. So that was a whistle-stop tour through Want to Take This Outside. That is very much a snapshot of a much larger piece of research that we've done, which we've got a series of videos on our website that you can take a look at, about 45 minutes of content in all, but well worth a look, I think, and there's a link there to go through for it. So you've heard a lot from me there, but I'm delighted now to invite Simon Carr, the Chief Strategy Officer from Hearts and Science, onto the stage, who's kind of come a long way, I think, in the journey of mental availability, and we'll have a little chat about some of his and my thoughts.
Kind of far away, so
I know.
it's on the opposite end of the stage.
We're not friends.
A bit closer.
So I've spoken a lot, Simon, so I don't know, do you want to kick off and just sort of tell people a little bit about the journey you've been on so far?
Yeah, so I was looking at actually when How Brands Grow was published. It's published 14 years ago, which seems quite staggering when we're in a room talking about category entry points. And it feels like category entry points is kind of this secret sauce that you can apply to strategy, which not many brands, agencies, or the wider marketing world are really talking about in any great detail. So I think it's fascinating that we're doing this today. I think one of the reasons for that is I think personally a lot of people have read How Brands Grow. But you bump into quite a lot of people who haven't actually read it, but have just read the summary and can talk about mental availability and physical availability to some degree, but don't really understand the full mechanics of what Lindsay's been talking about today. So I think the key unlock for me over the past few years has really been taking the theory of the Ernberg Bass Institute and turning that into action. And that for me is really critical. How do you take all of that theory and start to turn that into actionable strategy? And what we've done as an agency is we've started to turn some of that theory into tools and applications that takes that theory and puts it on planners' desktops and makes it much easier to plan with and think strategically with, rather than it just being kind of a nebulous theory.
I think that's always the difficult thing for me. It is very much a journey, isn't it? So I have a lot of conversations with people who there's almost this eureka moment where they're like, oh, I get a mental availability now. I understand this link between a category entry point and the brand links that go with it. But almost simultaneously, as the penny drops, the panic sets in, and they're like, oh, I really like it and understand it, but I haven't got a clue what my category entry points are. How on earth do I go about finding out what these entry points are? And I think that's what I've found to be one of the key stumbling blocks is just calming down and taking stock, because all the information is there about how you do this. I don't know if that's sort of similar to your findings when you've been working with specific clients.
Yeah, so I think the easiest way that we've found to deliver this and work with clients are those clients who already buy into the Ernberg Bass Institute way of thinking. If you already are a believer in the theory and are kind of a fully signed up fanboy or fangirl, it's definitely a lot easier to develop this way of thinking and apply it. But I think one of the key things I've found over the past couple of years is in regards to category entry points specifically, is to think about this from a perspective of the key brand metric, which is consideration. I tend to see most brands tend to have a consideration problem, a mid-funnel problem to some degree. And I think that's where category entry points becomes really powerful as a marketing tool, because it allows you to move away from what can be a hard metric to move, consideration. It's generally proven to be slow moving, generally moves very slowly over a long period of time. It's quite hard to affect in that kind of mid-funnel point, whereas category entry points are really interesting because they move you away from that kind of static version of consideration into a much more dynamic world of thinking about consideration, and all of the myriad dynamic consideration moments that we bump into on a daily basis and consumers bump into on a daily basis that Lindsay kind of alluded to with this kind of snack category. But that happens for all categories and all brands, and that's been a really powerful way of talking to brands and businesses about category entry points, is that way in with consideration and really rethinking how you think about consideration within the measurement framework, and starting to think about actually how can category entry points fuel that as kind of leading indicators. So that's the kind of the way in that we found has been really powerful, and is a way for everyone, I think, to think about it. And then, as you say, once you get into kind of how do you then deliver the theory into action, I think there's a few things. Lindsay mentioned the W's framework. It's a good place to start in terms of, when you think about category entry points, how do you use the W's framework in terms of who am I with, where am I, what am I doing, why am I entering that category. You can kind of go through a process of delivering that. We've developed kind of a number of different ways of doing that, whether you just get into a room with the marketing team and the wider business to workshop that, or whether you use topic modelling or ethnography or qualitative elements. There are a number of different ways to find out what those category entry points are. Within How Brands Grow, there's a clear way of how you design and structure a questionnaire. So there's lots of guidance in that way. And I think the one thing that Lindsay was obviously just talking about in terms of how you pick a fight with the specific category entry points. I think the key question we always come back to is, obviously there's lots of category entry points, and there are obviously brand linkages across each of those category entry points, and the three ways that Byron Sharp's talked about it. and the wider Rainbow Bass Institute. But I think there's also other ways of assessing and prioritising those category entry points and defining how important they are. So you can start to look at things like what are the delta between light buyers and heavy buyers, for example. So you can really start to understand where there's potential in that aspect. Or you can look at how important a category entry point is versus the overall linkage versus the category. So you can start to apply different lenses on the category entry points to really help you define which of the category entry points are the ones that you should go after.
I think that's one of the things that I've loved about this is that I think sometimes making the first step is really, really difficult, and all the work that Simon talks about there about establishing your category entry points and stuff like that. But when you're actually on the journey, I think life gets an awful lot simpler because you end up with this constant framework that you can continue to refer back to, and it almost keeps you on the straight and narrow because you always know, like, you'll start to work out that there's a few metrics that, in my opinion, you can really stop to, you don't really need to bother with. We used to obsess about brand awareness, incessantly. Yet, when you read the work of the Rainbow Bass Institute, you recognise that that's an odd metric because it doesn't reflect the way that we think about buying products. This does. This idea of kind of brand awareness, if you like, salience linked directly to a category entry point reflects the way that we think about and buy products in response to a specific need. Name a brand of soft drink. That's not the way that I think about buying products. That's not of significant value. And then once you've sketched out all of these kind of category entry points, you know what to keep referring back to. You can start to look at the ones you're attacking. You can hopefully build out your mental penetration until you start to bring it to a point of where you're perhaps competing, and then you can start to erode your competition and start to defend that category entry point. And all the time, you can start to make decisions about doing that moving forward. Keep checking in, tracking your mental availability to understand how well your media choices are doing it. And I think that's, for me, a real area for growth is using that as part of these sort of brand trackers and stuff like that. I don't know if that's sort of similar to some of the strategies that you employ with your clients.
Yeah, I think the diagnostic element is really interesting. It gives you a different angle on brand tracking. It gives you a different, almost like a leading indicators for consideration in the longer term by using category entry points in the shorter term, because they should be reactive, much more reactive to marketing if you're using them. And to the point that you're making in the presentation as well, it's like if other brands in the category aren't thinking in this way, so if brands in a category are defaulting to not necessarily how people are entering a category, so they're talking predominantly about range or value or convenience, whereas actually the category entry points are completely different. You've actually got a competitive advantage just by thinking about category entry points in that way for your category. And I think it also, once you start thinking about category entry points, you'll start seeing them in the wild all the time. You'll start to go, oh, actually, that business are definitely, they might not be talking about it, and they might be doing it by accident, but you suddenly start to see it everywhere you go. Lindsay's obviously shared a couple of examples, but you'll start to see it in everywhere that you go basically, as you kind of get into the wider world. And I think alongside this, one thing we haven't talked about is I think they're really, really useful as a further element in terms of how you manage a portfolio as well, because we work with the National Lottery, who have a house of brands and house of games. They've got a draw every day, and there are obviously questions over how do you manage that portfolio, and do you do that from an audience perspective? But actually, the way that we're starting to do that now, we're working with them is through an approach using category entry points to really understand where we dial up and dial down, which fights do we pick, which fights do we don't pick for each of the game brands accordingly. And that's a way that we're now starting to manage the portfolio, which we feel is offering a competitive advantage. And then I think finally, the final point on this is really about how category entry points offers really shared language, which I think is really important when we're talking about strategy in a business, whether that's in media or marketing or communications. And I think category entry points really brings us back to a world of what true comms planning, because it allows us to orient around what are the category entry points that we need to really orient the business around, whether that's in paid, owned, earned, or shared, and all of the agencies and disciplines and business can get behind what are the category entry points that we need to pick a fight with and win with, and I think that's really powerful as to placing comms planning back on the table as an art form.
I think I guess the last thing that I would say as well is that it's not just about the category entry points. That's one element of a much bigger ecosystem, but it can inform on a lot of other areas. So if you know, for example, that you've got really brilliant mental market share, but you're not shifting enough product, then you know where else to look, because you know you're doing one job right, but do you need to go and look at physical availability now? Is it that you're in the minds of people, but that's where your issue lies? Or we spoke about before about that idea of convergence, that mental penetration is high, but sales penetration is low, and then you can start to start to dig away at that and work out what's going wrong. But it all comes from this kind of one theory of mental availability, which I think is incredibly powerful. I think, is that about us?
You've got time for a couple of questions. Does anybody have any questions at all?
How good was that drawing? No, I'm joking. You said you kind of see them in the wild everywhere when you're out and about. Do you have any brilliant examples of anybody who's doing this really, really well at the moment in terms of a category every point they've picked and won? Anybody winning the fight, I would say.
Do you say that?
Yeah, you go for
I
it.
can take that. I think a really interesting one, I'll talk about none of our own work for a moment. I'll talk about someone else for a second. I think EE is really interesting. So they've obviously gone from talking about how fast their broadband is to obviously orienting around how you use it in terms of home, work, school, play, and gaming. Again, they've not talked about category entry points in any of their when they've kind of launched that work, but it feels like there's been a real shift in terms of how they think about product benefits to category entry points. And I think it's an interesting example of how they've, again, oriented that whole business around category entry points in my world, my view.
It's great creative across all channels as well, right? I'm probably buying extra share of voice, I guess.
Yeah.
I've seen it everywhere.
Yeah. I think another brilliant example is, I don't know if you've seen any of the work from Disney at the minute, but it just screams category entry point. There's one ad that's just like, I think it's something along the lines, you don't know Disney. Disney does comedy, and then it says it again, Disney does comedy. You look at this ad, 30-second TV ad, it tells you 4 times, Disney does comedy. There's no doubt as what you're telling me to associate you with it. So it's absolutely brilliant.
Thanks. This may be a really dumb question, but does thinking this approach have any relevance, impact on own brands, supermarket own brands or pharmacy own brands?
So what was that? Owned brands?
Own brands, like supermarket own brands or pharmacy own brands. Obviously, the way we see category entry points of products in a supermarket or in a chemist, we can go in different ways, and supermarket own brands now are getting more purchase on our behaviours.
Interesting question.
Do you know what? I've not had any direct experience of it, but I do know from reading Jenny Romiak's wonderful book called Better Brand Health, that her recommendation is when you look at own brand labels, that by and large they tend to have very small market shares, was her opinion, and therefore they can kind of be lumped together and forgotten about. I think that's very much category specific. I think if you have got an own brand label, that is obviously commanding either a significant amount of sales penetration or market share, then it should be treated like any other brand. One.
If you've got, I guess, a brand that has several category entry points or kind of, triggers or need states that might lead someone to consume that brand, how do you home in on one in, say, a broadcast above the line sort of campaign without narrowing the audience or how much your total audience will resonate with that particular trigger?
I mean, the general consensus from the Emberg Bass Institute is generally across a campaign or an overall kind of annual plan is to look at 3 to 5 category entry points. So generally honing in on one is generally not the advice really, in terms of just being so single-minded on one category entry point. As you say, there's probably when we've done this, there's you can have between 50 and 100 category entry points that you end up then narrowing down, and you don't want to do 100, but you need to kind of focus it in. I think that's also a question in terms of how you assess how you use owned and earned channels to support that. What is the most important category entry point, and then what are the other elements of the marketing plan that you can then use to support the other category entry points. as well. The way that one example is so, as I said, we work with the National Lottery, and for each of the game brands, there is very much a kind of a predominant lead category entry point that we use in kind of the widest possible communications part of the plan, and then there are other stages of the plan where we start to think about other category entry points which are more supportive category entry points. So you can start to order your kind of plan based on kind of the priorities of category entry points in terms of, and Lindsay's work as well kind of alludes to the, where's the maximum sales potential, how does that link back to, where do you want to pick a fight, and where are the kind of the more supportive elements, as in, do you want to enter new spaces in terms of new category entry points versus support existing ones. So I think it's then how you kind of concertina the overall marketing plan or media plan based on the category entry points work that you do.
I also think there's an opportunity now to refine some broadcast channels, still broadcast, but to use context to your advantage. So when we talk about category entry points, I shared with you 3 knockout blows there. There's actually 7 that we've developed, and one of those is about context. And I think it's really important that you can make a punch hit that much harder by targeting relevant moments. And I think that category entry points have like a life cycle, if you will. We don't run around constantly thinking about, I must have a streaming service for the kids, but there are points where it does come alive, and I call these category moments. And I think there are, if you take an example like for Pimm's, right? Pimm's is very strong category entry point of a drink to enjoy at a summer's occasion, for example. Now, I'm going to think about that when I'm buying it. So when I'm actually at the store buying it for that purpose, that's one moment I can target. I'm going to start to think about when I'm actively consuming it. So how close can I get to that point where I am actually sat at a party with a Pimm's, because that's more relevant. And then also there are other moments where we're just more likely to think about it. When I'm in a park with a bunch of mates talking about the next social occasion, and that's another moment. And I think that you can try and home in on these, what we call category buying moments, category consumption moments, and category relevant moments.
I think we're out of time, so please put your hands together.